95%. Hold that number before I give you any context. 95% of Australia, a landmass roughly the size of the continental United States, contains no permanent human population, not sparse population, not frontier communities, nothing. The country supports 26 million people, and virtually every one of them lives pressed into a thin strip of coastline. A narrow ribbon of habitation so compressed, it barely registers on a map of the continent. The interior, an area larger than all of Western Europe, sits empty. It has always sat empty, and the question that geography classes never quite answer is the most obvious one. What is actually out there that makes an area this size completely, persistently, and mysteriously uninhabitable? Hit subscribe before we go deeper. This isn't information you stumble on twice. Lock it in. Click now. For most of your life, you've probably looked at Australia on a map and assumed the empty interior was simply undeveloped, a frontier waiting for infrastructure, investment, or time. That's what the standard accounts suggest. But when you trace what actually happened every time civilization moved inland, the ghost towns that collapsed within a generation, the railways that ended in open desert, the wells drilled into water, too hot and too salty to use, an entirely different picture emerges. The Australian outback is not a land waiting to be settled. It is a land that has already delivered its verdict. That verdict was written in geology 300 million years ago, and it has not softened since. Over the next few minutes, we travel that interior barrier by barrier, from the coastal cities inward to the dead heart of the continent. What we find along the way will change how you understand Australian geography and how you think about what civilization can actually overcome. Here is a fact that looks simple until you do the arithmetic. Australia has 26 million people. 8 of its 10 largest cities sit directly on the coast. The remaining 2, Canberra and Adelaide, are within 60 miles of the ocean. Drive inland from any of them, and within 2 hours, the population density drops from millions per square mile to effectively zero. Within 4 hours, you are not rural. You are genuinely, completely, without another human being's eye alone. The conventional explanation is climate. The interior is hot and dry, so people naturally settled where conditions were manageable. That explanation isn't wrong. It is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Australia is the oldest stable continental surface on Earth, not old in the way that ancient cities are old, or even in the way that mountain ranges are old. Old in a geological sense that changes every assumption you bring to the question. The bedrock beneath the Australian interior has not been touched by significant tectonic activity, by mountain building, volcanic renewal, or the grinding pressure that continuously refreshes mineral content in soil in approximately 300 million years. Every other major landmass on Earth has been pushed, cracked, flooded, or folded within the last 50 million years. That process brings mineral nutrients from deep rock to the surface, creating conditions where soil can sustain agriculture, forests, and ultimately, permanent human settlement. Australia's interior missed all of it. The continent drifted away from its geological neighbors before any of that renewal could reach its heart. What remained was a surface exposed to rain and sun for 300 million years without replenishment. The result is what geologists describe as some of the most nutrient-depleted soil on the planet. Soil that looks dramatic from above, all red ochre and wide horizons, and is biologically exhausted at the level that actually matters: the capacity to sustain crops. When European settlers arrived in the 19th century, they brought the farming logic of Europe and North America. Soils that had been glacially refreshed, volcanically renewed, tectonically active within human memory. They planted, irrigated, and waited. For a few seasons, sometimes a decade, it worked. Then the yields declined. Then they declined further. Then the land produced nothing. Not because of bad farming practice, but because there was nothing left to give. The Australian soil had spent everything it had across geological time before any human being arrived to ask for it. This is why Australia's population map looks the way it does. The narrow coastal strip, particularly the eastern and southeastern rim, sits on marginally younger, marginally less exhausted geology, and receives Pacific moisture. It is survivable. The interior, past the last ridge of hills, is not. Not for farming, not for permanent settlement, not in any way that modern civilization recognizes as functional. The coast isn't where Australians chose to live. It is the only place the land permits them to. But someone always tests the limits. Someone always believes the land will make an exception. In 1878, a settlement called Farina was established in the northern part of South Australia, roughly 400 miles from Adelaide. The prospects looked genuine. The railway was coming. Rainfall had been above average for several consecutive years. Government surveyors assessed the land as marginal but workable, a phrase that, in the Australian interior, would prove to carry a specific and unforgiving meaning. Settlers arrived with families, livestock, tools, and the reasonable assumption that where trains could go, civilization could follow. They were wrong, not gradually wrong. Wrong in a way that became undeniable within 2 decades. The rainfall that had seemed encouraging revealed itself as an anomaly, not a baseline. Crops that had survived the first seasons began failing as the soil exhausted what little remained in it. Wells produced water that was brackish, barely usable for livestock, and unsuitable for crops. The railway arrived, and then it didn't matter, because there was nothing viable to transport. By the 1930s, Farina was a ghost town. Today it stands as a preserved ruin, stone walls dissolving back into the desert, visited by travelers who photograph it and drive on. It is picturesque in the way that gravestones are picturesque. You would want Farina to be an exception. One town, one bad location, one unlucky run of seasons. It is not. Australian historians have documented more than 100 interior settlements that followed the same arc. Arrival, optimism, partial success, slow failure, abandonment. Silverton, Milparinka, each founded on the belief that determination and infrastructure could override the land's fundamental character. Each one dismantled by the same forces. The pattern became consistent enough that researchers eventually identified what they called the rainfall gradient. Fallacy. Surveyors working inland during periods of above-average rainfall routinely concluded that the land was more viable than it was. They were measuring a temporary state and recording it as permanent. By the time the correction came, always as drought, always more severe than the preceding wet period, settlers were already committed, mortgages signed, children born, towns built on the certainty that the good years would continue. What makes these ruins more than sad history is what they prove about the scale of the problem. These were not poorly funded experiments. Many had government backing. Several had rail access. Some had access to what appeared, at the time, to be reliable underground water. Every controllable variable was controlled. They still failed because the variable that couldn't be controlled. The soil chemistry and the rainfall mathematics of a continent built to drain rather than sustain was the only variable that ultimately mattered. There is something quietly devastating about what the Australian ghost towns represent. The stone walls at Farina are still standing. The outlines of streets are still visible in the red dirt. Someone laid those foundations with the confidence that what they were building would last. It didn't last because the land itself, not drought alone, not mismanagement, not misfortune, refused to support it. Which raises the question the ruins cannot answer on their own. If private settlers failed, and government programs failed, and railways failed to unlock the interior, what made the engineers who came next believe that a road through the center of the continent would change anything at all? The Stuart Highway runs from Adelaide on Australia's southern coast to Darwin. On the northern coast, a distance of approximately 1,900 miles. Drive it end to end, and you pass through exactly 3 towns of any meaningful size: Coober Pedy, Alice Springs, and Tennant Creek, scattered across the entire length. Between them, stretches of 300 miles pass without a fuel station, a reliable water point, a phone signal, or another vehicle. The highway was fully sealed with asphalt only in 1987. Before that, sections were unpaved, and travelers who broke down on those stretches, before satellite communication existed, sometimes did not survive. The road was built not because anyone believed the territory beside it was habitable, but because Australia needed a military supply line to the north during World War II, when Japan's advances in the Pacific made the northern coast feel suddenly exposed. The Stuart Highway is not evidence that the outback can be occupied. It is evidence that crossing it required the full logistical apparatus of a wartime government, and still produced a corridor with effectively nothing beside it for 1,000 miles in either direction. Drive that highway today, and something happens to your sense of scale that no map prepares you for. You understand, in the abstract, that the outback is large. Then you drive for 4 hours, and the landscape is identical to what it was when you started. Red, flat, silent, spare, and the understanding shifts from intellectual to physical. The land is not merely large, it is indifferent in a way that no other geography quite replicates. Mountains offer drama, oceans have movement. The Australian desert simply continues. And then, if you are driving at night, you may see the Min Min lights. They have been documented since the 19th century, glowing orbs appearing on the horizon, following vehicles for miles, shifting color, and vanishing without sound or physical trace. The witnesses are not fringe observers. Geologists, police officers, military personnel, and Aboriginal Australians whose oral traditions describe the phenomenon centuries before European contact have all recorded encounters. For most of the 20th century, science had no explanation. In 2003, physicist Jack Pettigrew proposed Fata Morgana, an atmospheric refraction effect capable of bending light from distant sources across the horizon under specific heat and humidity conditions. The explanation accounts for some cases. It does not account for all of them, including instances documented in atmospheric conditions that technically rule out refraction. The Min Min lights remain, in the strict scientific sense, unexplained. The disappearances are harder to resolve with atmospheric optics. The Australian outback has a documented pattern of people entering it and not returning, not in numbers or under circumstances that always fit a clean environmental explanation. Heat is real. A healthy adult without water can die within hours when surface temperatures reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But a documented subset of cases involved experienced travelers with adequate supplies and known routes. In circumstances that investigation left inconclusive. The outback is 900,000 square miles. It reclaims evidence efficiently. A person can disappear into it and leave nothing that the desert doesn't erase within a season. The road continues north. The landscape doesn't change, but the most unsettling part is still ahead. If what you just learned bothered you, good. That means you're paying attention. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what we're investigating in the next video makes this look like the introduction. 3 separate systems define what it actually means to try to hold ground in the Australian interior. Not settle it, hold it. Each one reveals the same answer from a different direction. The first is the dingo fence, officially the dog fence, which at 5,600 kilometers is the longest fence on Earth. Built in the 1880s to separate the sheep farming regions of southeastern Australia from the dingo population destroying livestock. It runs continuously across the interior for approximately 3,500 miles. The fence works. Sheep farming remains viable on the southern side. But the fence does not maintain itself. A permanent workforce patrols it continuously, repairing sections damaged by weather and floods and the constant pressure of animals. Dingoes, kangaroos, feral camels, rabbits pushing against it from the north. Without that uninterrupted human maintenance, the fence fails within years. The outback does not tolerate passive infrastructure. 250 miles north of Adelaide, atop one of the richest opal deposits on Earth, sits Coober Pedy. Population, approximately 1,700 people. A number it has been unable to grow meaningfully in decades. Summer surface temperatures regularly reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The solution its residents arrived at was not air conditioning alone. It was excavation. More than half the population lives underground, in homes carved directly into the sandstone hillsides, where temperatures hold at around 75 degrees year-round. regardless of what the surface is doing. The underground church, the underground hotel, the underground museum. Kuba Pedy constructed an entire functioning community beneath the desert because the desert's surface is incompatible with ordinary human life. It is, in a sense, the most honest town in Australia, a settlement that openly admits it can only survive by hiding from the land it occupies. Then there is the water. Beneath the outback lies the Great Artesian Basin, one of the largest underground freshwater reservoirs on Earth, covering 660,000 square miles. When European settlers discovered it in the 1870s, the response was genuine euphoria. Water in the desert, in vast quantities, under natural pressure. Wells were drilled across the interior. Livestock were brought in. The continent suddenly seemed conquerable. The euphoria lasted until the water arrived. It emerged at temperatures exceeding 190 degrees Fahrenheit at many sites. It was loaded with salt and minerals at concentrations toxic to crops and damaging to cattle. It was not, by any practical agricultural measure, the rescue it had appeared to be. The Great Artesian Basin is real. The water is there. It is simply not the kind of water that supports the kind of civilization humans know how to build. 3 systems, 3 forms of resistance. The same verdict, differently delivered, every time. What the ghost towns, the highway, the fence, the subterranean city, and the scalding wells share is not coincidence. They are not separate problems. They are one system expressing itself through different mechanisms. Understanding it requires going back to the geology. Australia separated from the ancient supercontinent, Gondwana, approximately 45 million years ago, and in doing so, left behind the tectonic activity that drives geological renewal on every other major landmass. Tectonic movement forces mountains to form and erode, releasing minerals from deep rock to the surface. It drives volcanic activity that replenishes depleted soil. It produces the folding and faulting that keeps continental surfaces biologically productive across time. Australia, drifting north in geological isolation, lost all of it. The surface has been slowly degrading ever since, leaching nutrients, losing depth, oxidizing iron into that characteristic red. There is no agricultural solution to soil exhausted over 300 million years. No amendment program addresses depletion at this scale. The climatic layer compounds the geological one. The Great Dividing Range, running along Australia's eastern coast, functions as a moisture wall. Pacific weather systems push rain toward the coast, and the range holds it there. Rainfall drops sharply within 100 miles of the eastern seaboard. But the defining feature of the interior's climate is not merely low rainfall. It is the extreme volatility of that rainfall, driven by the El Niño's Southern Oscillation, the climate pattern linking Pacific Ocean temperatures to global weather systems. Australia sits in a position that amplifies El Niño effects more severely than almost anywhere else on Earth. During El Niño phases, the already dry interior can go years without meaningful precipitation. La Niña phases bring sudden destructive flooding. The oscillation between these extremes is not a weather pattern that agriculture or settlement can adapt to, because adaptation requires a stable baseline, and the Australian interior has never provided one. These two forces, geological exhaustion and climatic volatility, operate independently of each other. They reinforce each other, and they operate on timescales that dwarf any human intervention. No irrigation program, no soil science, no engineering project has a timeline long enough to address processes measured in geological epochs. The Australian interior is not waiting for the right technology or the right investment. The verdict was rendered before the first human being arrived, and it carries no expiration date. Here is what the Australian interior actually tells us, stated plainly. A continent can be, physiological sense, finished. Not damaged, not neglected, finished. The processes that make land livable ran their course in Australia hundreds of millions of years ago. Long before the first mammal appeared, long before any human consciousness existed to imagine building something permanent on its surface. That is the factual synthesis. The more searching question is what it reveals about us. In 2026, with satellite technology, desalination systems, solar power, and more accumulated engineering knowledge than any civilization in history has possessed. We have permanently settled approximately 5% of Australia, the edges, the thin coastal margin where the continent briefly tolerates human presence. Everything else remains exactly as it was. We did not conquer the outback. We found its perimeter, decided it was enough, and stayed there. Somewhere out there tonight, the Stuart Highway threads through 900 miles of darkness. No towns, no lights, no movement. Just the road and what it passes through, unchanged for 300 million years, indifferent to everything that has ever tried to alter it. Some landscapes do not ask to be understood. They simply endure.